I'd just like to start by acknowledging that there's obviously um, a lot of things going on in the region right now, including in Palestine, including in Israel, where at least one of our panelists is currently in a bomb shelter and hopefully will be rejoining us in a few minutes. But that we decided to hold this event anyway because the displacement in the West Bank, the settler violence, the forces pushing Palestinians off of their land and out of their homes are not only continuing despite the new war with Iran, but actually increasing pace and using it as a cover to accelerate and do things that might normally draw more attention. And we will absolutely talk about that in the in as we go on. Excuse me. Um, we're talking about displacement in the West Bank and expulsion and violence and it's difficult to frame these conversations because this is not something that started at any particular point. And I certainly, aside from liberation and democracy and the end of occupation, it's hard to delineate what could form a clean endpoint. This did not start on October 7th, although things got much, much worse after October 7th. In the year before, settler violence was already um, going to levels that were shocking and frightening. If you recall, 3 years ago, almost to this day, was the pogrom, as the Israeli Central Command um, commander called it at the time, of the Palestinian village of Hawara, um, where dozens of homes were torched, 100 people injured, and at least one person killed. Um, and you know, I it, and then October 7th happened, and things just kept getting worse and worse. I brought up Hawara not just because that felt like a significant event at the time, but because also I was listening to because I'm a little bit masochistic, some settler podcasts over the past few days, and they brought it up, and they brought it up in in the context of the nomenclature that it introduced to Israeli society, but also to the world, and it had different effects, and that nomenclature was erase Hora. If our viewers remember, um, the Israeli finance minister, who's also in charge of settlements, um, liked or retweeted something calling to erase Hawara, which myself at Dawn and others at the time, I believe, correctly labeled as incitement to genocide and certainly incitement to violence. Um, and that nomenclature, that erasure, um, entered the Israeli lexicon. It alarmed a lot of people outside, but then after October 7th, it became completely ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It was normalized. It is what happened in Gaza, and it's impossible to disconnect what Israel has done in Gaza over the past 2.5 years to what's taking place in the West Bank at the moment, right now, and in the past and the future. And that's not just because it happened at the same time, or because it had the same goals, which we'll also talk about. But this idea of pushing Palestinians out by force, by destroying their ability to stay, and mass killing, that's something that it was an opportunity that the Israeli settler movement seized on, and and the Israeli settler movement is the Israeli government at this point. Um, in addition, what we're seeing in the West Bank is not just settler violence. B'Tselem, where Sarit works and represents, had a report a few years ago called "Settler Violence is State Violence." I, completely agree with that. The military not only supports and encourages settler violence as it advances the aim of of control of more land and pushing Palestinians out. But in the past 2.5 years, and we'll hear more about this, it has become state policy. The difference between settlers and the military has become almost indistinguishable at times. And on top of that, the violence driving Palestinians off their land, while it's most dramatic in terms of square meters and square kilometers and miles in Area C and these sort of farming communities and the Jordan Valley and South Hebron Hills, don't forget that the Israeli army displaced and destroyed the homes of close to 30,000 people in refugee camps in Nablus and Jenin, and together, all of this, I think, is something that we have to look at, not just as in the same lens that we might have talked about it a few years ago, with regards to violent settlers and the threats they pose to villages, be it or demolition orders in places like Khan al-Ahmar or Susia. Um, so yeah, I wanna stop there and introduce our panelists, which I'll do one by one as we go to them. First up will be Omar Shakir, who is, as of a few days ago, the new executive director of Dawn, the organization that is hosting this webinar, and prior to that, spent a decade plus as the director of the Israel-Palestine program at Human Rights Watch. And first off, we're very excited to have you and to explore your expertise and knowledge and insights. And I want to hand it over to you to sort of kick off this conversation.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you all for tuning in. I know it might seem odd in some ways, maybe to focus on the West Bank, a few days into a harrowing regional escalation that could well have, seismic implications for the region for years to come. But I think actually having it now is really, really important because what we've seen, and this has really been a theme, is when the intention was on Gaza for 2+ years. We saw abuses of a scale without recent precedent taking place in the West Bank. The Israeli government very much used the cover of the focus on Gaza to advance their longstanding objectives in the West Bank. And I think in many cases, when you talk about the project of Jewish supremacy or the project of apartheid, the West Bank has always been the crown jewel. And so I think it's really critical in some ways at this moment, particularly as we're just seeing in the last days and hours, the closure of crossings into the West Bank, the increased restrictions on freedom of movement, the uptick in settler violence, which Sarit will give you a much more detailed account about. All of this reminds us of why it's critical that we keep the focus and the attention on the West Bank. So what I'm going to try and do in my 10 minutes is to give you sort of an overview of the current state of human rights abuses in the West Bank, based on research done by a variety of human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch. And then I'll obviously give it to Sarit and Munir, who'll be able to dive more into the legal and on-the-ground realities that we're seeing now. So I think when you start with the West Bank, I think the first thing to underscore is the significant uptick in the killings of Palestinians. Since October 7th, 2023, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. The average annual rate, and this is according to the statistics compiled by OCHA, the UN body in charge of humanitarian affairs. And the annual rate of killing is nearly 2x what it's been in the years prior. And as Mike noted at the outset, this wasn't a trend that started with October 7th, 2023. In fact, at Human Rights Watch on October 3rd, 2023, my colleague stood at the Human Rights Council and talked about the unprecedented repression of Palestinians in the West Bank, a trend when it comes to killings that dated back actually to 2022. But what we've seen, as again Mike noted at the outset, is just an increase in the intensity. So not in the kind of abuses, but in the intensity of killings. And human rights groups, including B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and many others, have documented the systematic, repeated use of excessive and unlawful force by Israeli forces, including summary executions. Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed at checkpoints. They've been killed on their way to work. They've been killed in their homes. They've been killed at demonstrations. They've been killed in contexts far and wide. And the uptick in killing is really, really significant given the trends that we've seen in years past. It's a years long and actually a decades long high. The second trend that I want to highlight, and again, Munir is going to get into the legal dimensions of this, is the escalation of forced displacement. And the main thing I want to focus on, which has gotten not nearly the attention it deserves, is the unprecedented displacement of Palestinians from refugee camps in the northern West Bank, Jenin, Nur al-Shams, and Tulkarm. The displacements that took place beginning in early 2025, a little over a year ago, are the largest displacements of Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. It's the second largest displacement of Palestinians in half a century, the first, of course, being Gaza since October 7th, 2023. What Israeli forces did was systematic and methodical. It started 2 days after a then temporary ceasefire took hold in the Gaza Strip. Israeli forces stormed first the Jenin refugee camp and later Tulkarm and Nur al-Shams. In Jenin, they did so with drones, with helicopters, with ground forces, with armored vehicles. They systematically ransacked homes. They forced people out of their homes. Altogether, from between the three camps, 32,000 Palestinians were displaced forcibly. These are all Palestinians who are refugees. They are either those that were forcibly expelled or forced to flee their homes during the Nakba in 1948, or their descendants who are again being displaced. They have been methodically blocked from returning to their homes in the camps, with very few exceptions over the past year. In addition to all of that, of course, the Israeli government has been destroying the homes and other buildings in these refugee camps. According to analysis Human Rights Watch published in November, 850 homes and other structures were entirely destroyed. A UN figure just from the first 6 months that includes partially damaged homes put the figure at well over 1,000. International law, and again, I'm going to leave this to Munir, gives very strict requirements. It bans forced displacement, except in certain circumstances, none of which have been met here. The displacement was not temporary. The Israeli government has made no showing of any military necessity to displace these entire refugee camps. They have provided no accommodations or other provisions for the community. These are families that have been left to fend for themselves, find housing with, if they're lucky, friends or relatives, otherwise mosques, shelters, etc. Human Rights Watch, in its analysis from November, found that the Israeli government's activities amounted not only to a violation of international humanitarian law, but war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. This is a model the Israeli government could very well expand to other refugee camps. I'll leave the rest again for Munir. The third trend I want to highlight is, and again, you're going to hear about it in depth from Sarit, is settler violence. Just to note that 2025 saw an 18-year high in the attacks against Palestinians by Israeli settlers. Just in the first 9 months, you had more attacks than any other year that the UN OCHA had recorded, in nearly 2 decades. What we've seen take place is entire communities erased off the map. You go back to the West Bank, you look at a map that's a few years old, there are communities that don't exist anymore. And the only other thing I'll say before I pass along is to highlight what Mike said in the beginning. These incidents have often taken place with soldiers, in some cases standing by, in some cases even directly participating in the violence. So it is 100% state violence with impunity ensured for the perpetrators. I just want to highlight a couple more trends before I wrap up. The expansion of settlements. You had, according to Peace Now, 25,000 housing units and settlements that advanced in the planning during 2025. That is an all-time high. It's never recorded that much in any year. And again, you've seen the takeover of Palestinian land with new legislation, again, that Sarit will cover later on. The fifth trend I want to highlight is ongoing home demolitions for Palestinians who lack nearly impossible to obtain building permits. That trend continued in 2025 with more than 1,600 homes demolished. And the final two trends to note is detention, arbitrary detention. Again, the number of Palestinians that were held in administrative detention without trial and charge, if you include the West Bank as well as Gaza, more than 4,500 Palestinians. Even just taking the number in the West Bank, the figure that we've seen since October 7th, according to the Israeli human rights group Hamoked, is a 30-year high in general, the figures that we've seen. More than 9,000 Palestinians in detention, arbitrary arrest and torture rampant, and then the conditions have gotten of a kind that we've simply not seen before. Denial of access to the ICRC, sexual violence, denial of proper food, medical attention, poor conditions, unprecedented numbers of deaths in custody. And the final trend, of course, is the restrictions on movement. And that's even preceding, of course, what we've seen in the last few days. We've seen all sorts of additional closure obstacles, delays at checkpoints, entire communities that are effectively boxed in. And again, all of this to note, and I'll really end on this note, is to underscore that all of this that I've highlighted has taken place in the last 2.5 years, where Israel was already committing apartheid and persecution. These crimes that were started way before this recent escalation. It's also happening at the time that the Palestinian Authority has in many cases been escalating its arbitrary arrest and mistreatment and torture of detainees. In many cases, the same group of people cycling between Palestinian Authority and Israeli detention. So really, really grave abuses that warrant the attention. Of course, the remedy and the answer, which I'll leave for the Q&A, really has to be continued action. The international community cannot let its focus on regional events or Gaza detract away from its duty to take basic action, impose an arms embargo on Israel, suspend trade agreements, with the Israeli government, targeted sanctions on abusers, supporting the ICC investigation. These are the only sorts of recourse that might have a chance of changing, banning trade with settlement, the recourse on the ground. I'll leave it here and thank you again and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Omar. Next, we're going to go to Sarit Michaeli, who is the International Advocacy Director at B'Tselem, Israel's oldest, if not certainly most accomplished human rights organization. And Sarit, I was hoping you could give us a little more detailed talk through of what's happening lately and why it's more urgent than it ever has been.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone, and بالنجاح, Omar, with your new role. So maybe I can just begin by repeating, and the main essential point about everything we are seeing throughout the West Bank. This is not the actions of any one individual. These are state actions. They're the actions of the Israeli government. And maybe the second point is that none of these things began with the current Israeli government, but they all have been exacerbated by these policies, right? And this is important because sometimes quantity is actually relevant, and the type of lack of law enforcement, the type of state-backed settler violence, and the type of state violence against Palestinian communities throughout the West Bank, and we're talking both about the rural areas and also the towns and cities, that those have been features of Israel's occupation and apartheid regime since its beginning, and certainly as it has evolved over recent years, it involves immense amounts of violence. But what we have seen with the advent of this government, together with its judicial coup internally inside Israel and its parallel judicial coup within the structures of Israeli control in the West Bank, is we see absolute and total support for all of this violence, no attempt to even obscure or hide Israel's involvement, no need to obscure or hide Israel's involvement, because there is no internal criticism, unfortunately, within Israeli society, barring a small subset of the Israeli public who are opposed to all of this. But ultimately, but broadly speaking, the majority, the dominant discourse within Israeli society is not critical of these governmental actions, and certainly doesn't go out to protest them. And therefore, the government can get away with much more than they could internally. And this is the bottom line. What we are seeing on the ground right now, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian communities that we are just seeing unfold in front of us. The most famous, the most live streamed ethnic cleansing, I think, in recent memory is essentially a parallel to the live streamed genocide in Gaza, and it is deeply connected to it. Since the so-called ceasefire in Gaza, even more pressure has been applied to Palestinian communities throughout the West Bank, but this is not, as I said, something that started with the ceasefire. And if I could just maybe try and give a very, very broad perspective of what is going on, I would say that Palestinians living throughout the West Bank, not just people, as I said, who live in small herding communities in remote rural areas, but also people living in the center of towns, the center of cities, or in very large villages, are all experiencing the same amount of or massive amounts of pressure, lack of any sort of protection, the inability to receive any sort of security from, theoretically, the types of institutions that, again, theoretically are meant to safeguard them and provide them with security. The Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities cannot provide this kind of security. And these are all policies that the Israeli government is enacting using settler violence as a very convenient tool that the Israeli government uses with plausible deniability. We would argue there is no longer any plausible deniability for the state-backed elements of Israeli settler violence. And this is done in order to push Palestinians as further away from the open land in the West Bank and to concentrate them, push them into these enclaves in areas that are very densely populated. In the past, we would be able to say that this is an attempt to drive Palestinians out of Area C of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank that have been placed under temporary Israeli control during the Oslo Accords. I would go much further than that. I think in recent years, we can see that settlers have stopped using this term Area C because they're talking about a much bigger thing. They're talking about removing Palestinians from all open land around the West Bank. And if you speak to Palestinians, since the establishment of this government, and also much more so since October the 7th and the beginning of Israel's genocide, they will tell you again and again that what they are seeing right now, what they're experiencing right now, is violence that is aimed at removing them, not just from these remote olive groves, but the violence is aimed at basically pushing them into their own homes, and in some cases removing them from their homes, even in large established villages. According to B'Tselem's tracking, B'Tselem tracks this, over 4,000 Palestinians have been basically cleansed from over 53 whole communities by settlers acting with the full support of the Israeli government over the past 2.5 years. This is in addition to the refugees that Omar described, who were removed, who Israel forcibly transferred from refugee camps. We're talking about vast areas of the West Bank that have been left completely empty of Palestinian inhabitants. Palestinians cannot step in them. They cannot enter them under any circumstances. They will be immediately attacked by Israeli settlers if they enter. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dunams, and the last remaining Bedouin communities that existed in the entire land between Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Jericho have all been displaced in recent months through this, as I said, this intense violence. The one other point I'd like to mention specifically on this, and we can kind of continue to talk about other issues, is that this is all exacerbated by other Israeli actions throughout the West Bank. For example, shutting up all of the almost all of the gates that have been placed outside Palestinian villages throughout the West Bank, prohibiting movement in main checkpoints, prohibiting the movement of people supplying, for example, gas, and placing restrictions on the sale and the provision of gas. So there are many, and cooking, both gas for cars and cooking gas. So there is an intense amount of pressure directed and deliberately directed by the Israeli government against all Palestinians living throughout the West Bank, that isn't expressed purely in security, in forces, Israeli forces violence, or in Israeli settler violence, but is expressed in the form of economic pressure that is bankrupting communities, that is devastating people's livelihoods altogether, forming an intense assault on Palestinians by the Israeli government throughout the West Bank. I should also say that there are a small number of activists on the ground, Israeli protective presence, solidarity activists, as well as international solidarity activists who are still present in some communities who are resisting totally non-violently through documentation and media work, this pressure. The numbers are very small. Palestinian activists are almost incapable of reaching these areas. They will be almost immediately arrested. If they go outside of their own communities, they can be placed under administrative detention. So it's really primarily up to a very small number of Israeli and international activists who are still out there on the ground. Other than that, the people who are facing this intense pressure are Palestinian communities that are some of the already most disenfranchised and weakened and destabilized communities throughout the West Bank, because they've already been living in this Israeli created humanitarian catastrophe, for humanitarian disaster, through this whole policy of demolishing their homes, putting pressure on their ability to live. So we're talking about communities that are facing this intense state pressure, and unfortunately, together with the support by the U.S. administration for Israel's action throughout the West Bank, it's very hard to see how the very few remaining communities on the ground in the rural areas can survive.
Thank you, Sarit. And I have a lot of follow-up questions. But next, we're going to go to Munir Nuseibah. Munir is professor of international law and the head of the Human Rights Clinic at the Faculty of Law and the head of the Community Action Center at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. Munir, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's an honor to be with all of you and with all the distinguished panelists, and before all the people who have joined us today, who are interested to to learn about this further at these difficult times. So I'll be examining the forcible displacement and ethnic cleansing in international law, which is basically, it has been very clearly illegal, as I would just summarize it from the beginning, since the end of the Second World War until today, with no exceptions whatsoever. But I will be further exploring this, hopefully quickly. But before doing that, okay, is the slide going? It's moving? Okay. It's very important to contextualize and what we are witnessing today, and both distinguished panelists have mentioned this also, that this is not a new phenomenon. It's not something that we see today that we haven't seen before. Forcible displacement has been ongoing since 1947, basically, because this is the way that Israel has been thinking since the day of its establishment. It always thinks about demographic ratios, how many Jews versus how many Palestinians. There is a very strong colonial motive behind all of the displacements that have been taking place since 1947 until today. I would say forcible displacement has never stopped Since 1947 until today. The Nakba in 1948 was an important event where 80% of the Palestinian population were forcibly displaced from their homes in the areas that became Israel where Israel assumed its sovereignty after 1948. And then the same type of action continued in 1967. Most recently, we have seen also in Gaza Strip a very similar displacement. 90% of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been displaced either internally or beyond international borders during the genocidal campaign on the Gaza Strip. And as soon as this happened, we've heard the voices that called for colonization of the Gaza Strip. In the same way, the displacements, as explained by Sarit today, that are taking place are also linked to colonization, the colonization of the West Bank. These settler groups are groups that are planning and working very hard and succeeding, by the way, in colonizing more and more land progressively as we go. Of course, Palestinians have been, since the Nakba of 1948, looking back, wanting to return to their homes, never wanting to leave their homes. And that's why the issue of displacement continues to be one of the major issues in the Palestinian cause. Because Palestinians, like most refugees in the world, are looking for asylum and for the movement from one place to the other, and for their right not to be forced to return to their homes. Palestinian refugees and displaced persons are always looking back. They want to return home. And this is an important element, maybe, that must be understood when you think about Palestinians and the Palestinian mentality. Look at the people returning to Gaza today, despite the fact that Gaza is a totally destroyed area. So we're talking about a population that really wants to live in its homeland, and in homeland I don't mean like the big picture, like the homeland. I also mean cities, villages, specific communities. Palestinians are very specific about their identity, and this is something that we can talk about for hours, but that's not the objective of my talk right now. I've been looking at displacement, throughout my, I would say, academic and professional career. And around 13 years ago, I wrote a policy brief for Al-Shabaka, where I think that I tried to look at the ways that is the methods that Israel used to displace Palestinians. And I managed to find six general methods, including the use of violence during the times of war, as you can see, from the Nakba to 1967 to what is happening today in the Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank. But also there are many other methods that are being used simultaneously. One of them is engineering personal statuses in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, where people are given a status that is then revoked for a number of reasons. And we always see that the laws that regulate these issues will only develop in one direction almost, where there are more reasons to revoke and to deny statuses from Palestinians. And this would take hours also to explain. But also you have the discriminatory urban and country planning, which results in continuous demolition of homes. You have dispossession, which is also happening today in the West Bank, by the way. Dispossession of property of Palestinians using discriminatory laws that will always take the land from Palestinians, land and real estate, houses, etc., and use it for the benefit of colonial projects. But then you have deportations under security justifications and emergency laws, and finally creating unbearable circumstances in certain areas, which I think Sarit has also examined in her presentation. Now I will start with what I've been requested to say, but I think it's always important to contextualize because at the end of the day, the message that I want to say is that displacement is such an important part of the Israeli colonial policy that has started since the day of its establishment as a state until today, and I think it's getting worse as we go, as explained by both panelists, Omar and Sarit. So. Um, Forcible displacement in international law has been contrary to international law very clearly since the Second World War, and most notably since the Nuremberg tribunals. In the Nuremberg tribunals and the Tokyo tribunals, the international community, or at least the victors in the war at the time, drafted the London Charter and the Tokyo Charter, which examined both war crimes and not examined, which stipulated war crimes and crimes against humanity and defined them. And deportation was one of these crimes. And therefore, since that time, deportation and forcible displacement have become contrary to international law in a very obvious way, especially after the General Assembly of the United Nations decided to adopt all the principles that came out of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals as part of international law that is binding to the whole international community. And it's very significant because customary international law is indeed binding. And this means that this crime that has been defined in the London and Tokyo Charter has been considered a crime at least since the Second World War. And therefore, it has been illegal for a very long time, indeed. But then the international community after the Second World War started, to regulate and to codify international law. And one of the important conventions that was decided or that was drafted and adopted by the international community is the Fourth Geneva Convention. And in the Fourth Geneva Convention, the international community indeed decided to add Article 49, which states that individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or that of any other country, etc., is prohibited. So they basically here in this article, they the countries that adopted this treaty, which is also reflects customary international law in this case, decided to consider deportation and forcible transfer as a crime. I will later talk about what's the difference between deportation and forcible transfer. I will run quickly into the more recent history, and I'll go to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And the Rome Statute is very relevant to us because the International Criminal Court has indeed decided that it has jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territory, and it defined its territory of jurisdiction in the territory of the State of Palestine as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Therefore, any crime taking place in that territory is under its jurisdiction, and it can prosecute individuals who are in charge of these crimes. Indeed, the Rome Statute defined crimes against humanity, and it included deportation or forcible transfer of population as part of crimes against humanity. So it is indeed a crime against humanity. And also, it included the unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement also as a war crime. So, and the difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity is that war crimes have to be in the context of an armed conflict or a military occupation. So any case of deportation or forcible transfer in an occupied territory is a war crime. Crimes against humanity can happen against any civilian population, not necessarily under occupation, but they have to be widespread or systematic. That's the main difference between the deportation in both categories of crimes. But I would say, as a quick conclusion in a short presentation, that the crimes that we are witnessing today will fall under both. They are both war crimes and crimes against humanity in the way that they are defined as, deportation or transfer. The deportation has been examined mostly. Forcible displacement and ethnic cleansing has been examined by the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. Because that was an important court or tribunal that indeed had to examine a lot of actions that took place in the war that took place in former Yugoslavia, and ethnic cleansing was one of these crimes that used to take place, and therefore they indeed exercised their jurisdiction there and prosecuted a number of criminals, and the court defined the elements of the crime, that there needs to be a forcible displacement of individuals. These individuals must be lawfully present in the area from which they were displaced, that there are no grounds under international law permitting for their displacement, and the forcible displacement must be across boundaries, and that it must be carried out intentionally. And here is a difference between deportation and forcible transfer. Deportation happens across boundaries, so you have to cross international border in order to be a victim of the crime of deportation. If you have been moved internally displaced within certain boundaries, then you are a victim of another crime called forcible transfer. So international law has divided the crime into two. What we call forcible displacement as a general term, it's one of the two. It's either deportation if you've crossed international borders, or transfer. But in any case, both of them are crimes. Both of them are equally criminal. It's not that one of them is criminal and one of them is not. And here, I think it's important for us to learn from the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, because there is the question of what does forced mean? What does forcible mean? What does it mean, the term forcible? And this is important because if you follow the news especially over the past, couple of years during the genocide in Gaza, you will find that there are senior Israeli politicians who keep talking about voluntary transfer, right? Voluntary migration, that we want to encourage the Palestinians in Gaza and also in the West Bank to move voluntarily, right? And this is mentioned quite frequently. And I think that there is a stupid legal advisor who must have told them, look, forcible transfer is a crime, so never talk about forcible transfer. Use voluntary; it becomes illegal. It gives you more protection. And I think this is it's at the end of the day, this will not work in court, and that's why it's very important to understand what the word forced means. And the court, this is now I'm quoting the court. It says that forced displacement means carried out by expulsion or other forms of coercion, such that the displacement is involuntary in nature, and the relevant persons had no genuine choice in their displacement. And then it added, it is the absence of genuine choice that makes the displacement unlawful. So basically, if a person has moved from one place to another, whether internally or externally or beyond borders, without a genuine choice, this amounts to displacement. You can call it voluntary, you can call it whatever you like. It continues to be the crime of forcible transfer or deportation. The court added, these methods would include fear of violence, right? Not even the violence, the fear of violence, duress, detention, psychological oppression or abuse of power, or taking advantage of a coercive environment. Coercive environment, making your life impossible in a way that will force you to move. Of course, international law has also given very specific situations where people can be moved from their homes, which is during military operations. But these circumstances are very restricted to imperative military reasons or for the security of the civilians themselves. And then the civilians must be transferred back as soon as the hostilities in that area has ceased. So basically, you can only move people temporarily, but no permanent deportation or transfer. What we have been witnessing since the Nakba until today is a continuous displacement, as I explained earlier, but also a continuous prevention of return. We know that once a Palestinian is moved out of their homes, it is almost impossible to be able to return, to be allowed to return, because Israel has this regulatory regime that makes sure that people are unable to return to their homes or to the country if they have been deported abroad. And that's why that's part of the equation. And the prevention of from return itself is a continuing crime that can be also looked at separately. Finally, or almost finally, I should also mention a couple of things in terms of legal analysis, which we have no time to examine deeply. But it's important here to mention that displacement is an action of apartheid, because apartheid, at the end of the day, is a number of inhumane acts that are organized in order to preserve a certain hegemony of one racial group over the other. And displacement, if you look at why Israel is displacing Palestinians on a continuous basis, you will understand that it's part of this system of hegemony of one group over the other. Also, it's an action of persecution as it is defined in international law and in international criminal law more specifically. But also, what was an important conclusion made during the Gaza genocide recently is that it's a component to genocide. On the 13th of October, 2023, Israel ordered over 1 million Palestinians to move from their homes south with no protection, nowhere to go, and then destroyed and burnt 90% of their homes, and also destroyed many other things not only homes. This is an important component of the genocidal act in Gaza. Of course, then you add a lot of other elements to understand the genocide more comprehensively. Of course, it's also important for us to mention here that the International Court of Justice in 2024, in its advisory opinion, also declared that the whole Israeli occupation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the West Bank, of course, is illegal. Therefore, all the measures that Israel is taking, whether regulatory, changing the legal system basically, or executive or other things, are in their nature illegal as well, adding to the illegality of the Israeli regime. Now, how do Palestinians deal with this reality? The Palestinian approach is basically two things. On the one hand, we try as much as possible, as you can see on the picture on the right, to stay in our homes, in our lands as much as possible. We resist displacement on a continuous basis, and I'm sure you have seen this. If you observe and follow Palestine, you have seen how Palestinians will stay in their homes against all odds. But also, we will always, if we have been displaced, we will always carry our keys and say we want to return. We're still calling for return of every person who has been displaced since the Nakba until today. And indeed, the remedies for all of these things must be truth first, to understand what has been going on. prosecution of those who are responsible for these crimes, not only now, but also before, to reform the regime and dismantle the apartheid regime, basically, and to provide reparations for the victims, which includes first and foremost restitution of property, compensation, and satisfaction. Apology is only one of these of the shapes of satisfaction. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Munir. That was very comprehensive. I'm going to pose a few questions to our panelists, but I want to start with an anecdote that's been on my mind recently and probably for well over a decade, which is I remember when I was a journalist in Palestine, and Sarit, you were probably there for this. I mean, literally, probably next to me. That then Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman was trying to move forward with the complete erasure of the small village of Susia in the southern West Bank. And together with the Palestinian Prime Minister, 27, maybe it was 26 European ambassadors showed up in a convoy, and they stood there and they said, we will not let this stand. And sure enough, the Israelis backed off. But they certainly didn't give up. And that's been the approach over decades and decades to effectively bet on the limited bandwidth of the international community, to intervene, to oppose, to take any meaningful steps. And that was without the shadow of Gaza. That was without the shadow of Iran. That was without this government, which this Israeli government, which is doing things openly that others used to sort of create plausible deniability around, as you said, Sarit. Now, and I'm not entirely sure who this question is to, but yeah, I mean, so let's talk about impunity here, but also what could actually deter this, because settlements and the West Bank in particular, and I think it'll be interesting to talk about why this is the case, have been one of the sort of buckets of the Palestine situation that the international community has always been most willing to engage on. And I think that's reflected also in the human rights community's focus on it over the years. But as we've all mentioned, these are forces and policies and actions that go from all the way through Israel proper today to Gaza to the West Bank and beyond. We've seen that as far back as the first Bush administration withholding loan guarantees to the Israeli government to get them to pause settlement or to freeze settlement expansion. We've seen UN Security Council resolutions, countless Security Council resolutions declaring that settlements are illegal and that they must end. We have the International Court of Justice from a couple of years ago, followed by a General Assembly resolution, stating unequivocally that Israel's presence in the occupied territory is illegal, that it must withdraw immediately. The General Assembly actually set a 1-year deadline, and that settlers and settlements must be removed. And then, I think perhaps the most surprising of these developments, although it was very short-lived and probably counterproductive in the end, was the Biden administration's ad hoc sanctions program against violent Israeli settlers, which, perhaps identified the problem, but focused on the wrong place to address it. So back to my Susia story, the actions that the international community has taken over the years have at best slowed Israel's progress in its plans to take over more land, to displace more Palestinians. Is it actually still useful to be focusing on the West Bank as the most acute and urgent sort of place where something can be done? Or are we actually playing into this sort of sleight of hand where the bigger project is actually going much more full steam elsewhere, and we're stuck looking through this narrow frame of IHL and temporary military occupation and the prohibition on settlements there simply because there's a consensus around it in the international community? I'm going to let anybody jump in on that one.
There's so much here that each and every one of us could respond probably. Maybe I could say a few things about this. So if we want to start with a diplomatic visit to Susia, so last week the EU heads of missions visited Susia after settlers firebombed homes and vehicles in Susia. This is crazy. I mean, and this is not something that's happening like once a month. We used to talk about these pogroms as if they were something very rare when the pogrom in Hawara happened, but now they are a daily occurrence. I get videos probably on an hourly basis these days through WhatsApp and other groups from people throughout the West Bank documenting insane things. But in any case, I have to grant it for the EU heads of missions. So senior diplomats from the European Union and its member states visited the home of Hamdan Balal, who's also the Oscar-winning director, who was attacked last week by settlers. I think probably whose identity is well known to the Israeli authorities. And I think it's important as a show of solidarity, but I think it also highlights the gap between diplomats on the ground and their awareness and understanding of the deep problems and the issues that are at hand, and the total lack of willingness of political actors, both in Brussels and in member states and in capitals, to really confront both Israel and the US administration on state-backed settler violence, on all of this Israeli violence. And I think this is crucial because the visits on the ground are important, but the most important thing is action. And, this is something we repeat again and again. We have not seen action. We haven't seen a significant EU action on the genocide, let alone on what we are seeing on this, absolutely horrific reality throughout the West Bank. And I should also say on the reality of displacement and transfer and ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, which is something that we should all be paying attention to as well. So maybe that's the first point. The problem, I think, isn't diplomats on the ground. They understand very well the Israeli intentions. They understand very well what Israel is trying to achieve through settler violence and through other means. And I think there is just simply such a lack of willingness to confront anyone. There's this kind of like wait and see approach. And this is not just on communities that have been displaced. It's, for example, on something that used to be a massive red line for the European Union, which is the annexation of Ma'ale Adumim, the construction of this, quote, the famous E1 Israeli settlement, the plan to construct the southern section of the so-called apartheid road. So all of these things that used to be very, very important red lines for the EU, are no longer even raising a lot of traction. And certainly the red lines of yesteryear are today's nostalgia, I would say. The situation is so incredible that there are no red lines left. I mean, there's or I shouldn't be saying that because clearly tomorrow something even more shocking will happen. But I really think it's important to remember that what we're seeing out now on the ground is the result of many, many years of Israeli governmental policies. And it's also the result of the kind of like the first, year, more or less a little bit over a year of the Trump administration, because towards the end of the Biden administration, I would not want to say that there was positive engagement when it comes to the West Bank, but there were a few diplomatic efforts on behalf of the Biden administration that I think managed to somehow stem the tide of forcible transfer that erupted after October the 7th. And now we're seeing all of that obviously totally eroded because the U.S. administration is completely backing up everything that the Israeli, the most extremist version of the Israeli settler lobby, which is essentially our government right now, is doing. And I certainly think that the fact that Israeli policymakers of all levels, so both military and political players, know they are going to face literally no consequences, both from the United States or from Europe, because the European sanctions that still exist in a very minor way are not actually having any, or they're not actually effective. I think this is a very clear part of the picture. Why, I mean, when settlers are acting with impunity, when Israeli ministers and Israeli generals are acting with impunity in the West Bank, I think that it's our obligation, and maybe just to respond to one other point you made, it's our obligation as human rights defenders and as people who are present on the ground and are reporting from the ground to constantly repeat and explain that this is all connected, that the genocide in Gaza is not disconnected from the situation throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that these, and of course in the broader context, and that these are policies that are very much linked, that wishing to destroy Gaza in order to reoccupy it, which is something that many very, very powerful Israeli politicians are promoting right now, is not, there shouldn't be this kind of like balancing act of giving something to the Israeli government in order to salvage something else. All of these things are linked, and the only way the international community will possibly have a fighting chance to, to kind of stop or somehow resist these crimes is through a very clear linkage of all of these things together. I'm not saying I think this is happening on the ground. On the contrary, I actually think very often there's like a kind of a perspective of many international players. Obviously, this is a very broad statement, so I wish I had more time to kind of go much more into it, but that, we've just kind of used up all of our political capital on Gaza or on East Jerusalem or on the West Bank, and then we cannot kind of spare additional political capital. I think this is a very, very misguided approach. I mean, I obviously understand politics. It's not when none of us are naive. We understand the reality on the ground, but I do think that when there is more and more resistance of these trends, both from Palestinians on the ground who are like really struggling to stay on their land, and activists who are supporting them, and the international community, certainly you really need to, this all needs to be backed up by international policymakers holding a firm position, and we certainly do not see that.
Thank you, Sarit. I'm going to come back to you in a second with a question about how specific policies have changed or could change that reality even further. But first, Munir, I want to ask you perhaps a difficult question as a lawyer. We've all mentioned in different ways the through line between, from 1947 and before to what's happening today. And there was an article in Haaretz by Israeli historian Adam Raz a few weeks ago that, provided Israeli documentation for what Palestinians have been, knowing and saying for decades, which is that, terror and violence and deliberate, expulsion by force was used to depopulate the sort of historic Palestine in 1947, 1948, and 1949. And I was also struck that in your presentation, Munir, you mentioned the different types of displacement, and many of them are still in use within 1948 Israel today, from discriminatory zoning and land planning and land regimes to economic discrimination. And recently they started stripping Palestinian citizens of Israel, in a very small number so far, of citizenship, and even declaring they're going to deport one of them to Gaza. So my question to you is this, and I say this as a non-lawyer, and I have the benefit of not having invested years of my life in law school to be able to ask this, which is, in this moment when international law is being dismantled, when it means less and less, and particularly in the context of the past 100 years, where it's meant so little, or rather it's provided so little to Palestinians beyond perhaps something to grasp to sort of justify the justness of their struggle. What does international law offer us today in a way that can actually be leveraged? Um,
Yeah, that's an important question indeed, and especially at the time of genocide, as we saw it, and while people were hoping that international law might provide some protection, and maybe when South Africa went to the International Court of Justice and requested provisional measures, which actually took, it was thinking mainly about protection of the civilian population. But Israel ignored that, and now the United States is fighting international courts, right? And organizations that are providing information to the International Criminal Court specifically, making them illegal, sanctioning them, etc. So it's adding to the disaster, and your question becomes very relevant. But I'll tell you, as a person who has invested his time in and energy and thoughts in international law, I never thought that international law alone is going to liberate Palestine or to bring justice or to bring peace alone, right? It's not that I don't believe in it. I believe in it. I'm investing a lot of time in it, but I don't think that on its own it has the capacity to bring about the objectives that I think all of us here are looking for. But at the same time, international law is still very important because, on the one hand, it is an international, non-sectarian, non-national uh, body of criteria that defines what you are entitled to. And that's very important because look at Palestine, for example, Palestine, Israel, the whole thing. Look at the discussion. You will find that a lot of the discussion, you'll find that there is an Israeli minister who says, you know what, or not minister, like a whole state that says, you know what, God promised us this, right? And God's promises are not part of international law. International law is more about what you are allowed to do as a state and all of that. And it's not only the Zionist narrative that brings in God into the question, or other maybe national or racial or other types. There are many in the world. Every identity, every religion, every national group, every group that believes it's supreme and above others, comes up with a story, right? And the good thing about international law is that it does fight racism. It does give us standards that can help us to understand actually what we are entitled to, away from our national and religious and narratives. And this is very helpful for us because we can know what is a certain standard of justice that goes beyond our identities. So I believe that this is an important part of international law. But in addition to that, using international law, we are able to document crimes and to know what we shall expect in the future. Now, I also don't believe in that justice will certainly be served at the end. We have seen situations where injustice was followed by injustice and a genocide. The countries have been built on the fruits of genocide. Think about the United States, for example, or Canada, or all these colonial countries in the world that have been built on genocide. Yes, there is still resistance by the indigenous populations until today, but go to any city that has benefited from colonialism, and you will see that injustice has actually brought fruits to these colonial powers. So I don't believe that it's necessary that justice will prevail, but at least as long as we are indeed working towards justice, international law does give us a language and expectations and we will know when the liberation takes place, when we have dismantled apartheid, and when we are actually thinking about how to do that and where to go further. National law will be a basis for us to learn about what to do. Who we're going to prosecute, for example, who is entitled to reparations, and how. All of this is there in international law, and also is there. I've studied in transitional justice for my PhD, and that was helpful because you could see countries that were in a terrible reality of injustice, and then they transitioned to a different reality. And you learn about that, and you see that, yes, maybe reports that human rights organizations, like, like any of the organizations that we here represent, were put in the drawer for a certain period of time. But then at a certain moment, they were taken out of the drawers and put into practice, because then, there was the opportunity was there to bring about justice. So I believe that any report that any of us are writing today is not insignificant, even if it goes to the drawer and we don't see the protection that we seek, but it will help us and it will inform us in the future when justice is available for us. But currently, the political reality is terrible. And indeed, as you said, international law is, Trump specifically is trying to destroy it, but he's not the only one in this world.
I have a completely unrelated follow-up question. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit brief so we can get in a few more questions. You're at your actual physical location and area of the clinic is about Jerusalem, which, in English at least, at Israel's urging, we tend to distinguish from the West Bank, even though it was all captured at the same time from the same territory. It's just administered slightly differently. Have the trends that we're seeing in the West Bank been happening in parallel in Jerusalem? I mean, obviously, there's a long history of displacement and from home demolitions and taking over homes to revoking residency and the right to be there. But it's something we've heard quite less about over the past two and a half years. And I'm wondering if you can give us a quick overview of what that's looked like.
Yes, there are things that are more visible and things that are less visible. The things that are visible are, for example, destruction of certain homes and displacement of certain communities in Silwan or in other areas. But then there are the things that are less visible, but that we will see the consequences of in the future. For example, Israel is leading a land title settlement today and is registering land, real estate in Jerusalem. People are not really engaged. Palestinians are not really engaged in this process. Many of them don't know where this is happening and how it is happening, and all of that. Of course, the whole process is illegal in international law, but Israel is doing it nonetheless. And it is registering land under different names, unrelated to those who are inhabiting the land and inhabiting the houses. And this is happening. So basically, it's like pulling the carpet from beneath you while you are sitting on it, right? This is what's happening now in Jerusalem. Land title settlement is, I think, very dangerous. We will see the consequences of that in a few years from now. Probably once the land title settlement project has been over, once land is registered in the names of some colonial settler groups that are collaborating with the state institutions to be able to do that. Then there are, there are other measures also taking place in Jerusalem on a continuous basis, on a daily basis, including the laws of revoking residencies based on breach of allegiance, based on revoking, for example, family unification permits for family members because some distant family member has been accused of terrorism. This is another thing that the Israeli Knesset has approved. And so there are a lot of policies and a lot of regulations and laws, or even passed by the Knesset itself, that are moving towards, and there are also plans, zoning, a plan in Atarot at the airport, the Jerusalem airport that used to be Jerusalem airport one day, a plan in Sheikh Jarrah for 318 residential units in an area called Harun, and others. There are a lot of zoning and planning happening today, and that's not visible for us today because it's all in documents, it's all in papers today. But once this gets into like bulldozers on the ground, demolishing or building colonies, then it will become more probably visible for people.
Thank you, Munir. Sarit, I have so many questions I'm not going to get time to ask you, so I'm going to focus on the one that feels most pressing right now, which is that a lot of legal regulations and laws have been introduced in the past few weeks, really, that very much changed the way that Israel is administering the West Bank, and almost exclusively designed to benefit settlers and settlement expansion. Some of these are as benign sounding as, expanding the jurisdiction of environmental regulatory agencies. But similar to what Munir was talking about, also really dramatic changes to the land registration process. As somebody who's been tracking the Israeli settlement movement and its direct effects on Palestinians in the West Bank for a very long time, I wonder what your thoughts are on how this could change that trajectory in the coming months and years.
Well, I'm just making sure. Yeah, the audio. Look, I mean, I think this is. Maybe I could join actually, or segue from what Munir described as quite accurately as the catastrophe that East Jerusalemites are facing when the full extent of the settlement of title really comes into force, once this process is completed, and explain that this is also going to happen throughout the West Bank very soon. I think what I'd like to say is that it's worthwhile looking at all the technicalities, at how Israel has changed the kind of, the system of governing the West Bank Palestinians, and how the system of governing settlements has been changed, has been altered over the last 3 years. But and there are many small changes that amount, or not small changes, many changes that amount to the big picture of basically, essentially, a clear annexation of the territory in spite of not wanting to pay the political price, possibly, that could be the result of declaring an annexation. I think, and under the current reality, it's quite possible that Israel could get away with simply annexing the West Bank formally and not even paying any sort of price. But I think the best example, if we're trying to be brief here, is actually a discussion of the long-term plan. I think in the past, I used to not be, I would try and be quite limited in the kind of fears and risks that we would discuss regarding the long-term plans of the Israeli government. Ultimately, we would say that it appears, based on all of Israel's actions on the ground, that its long-term intentions are to maintain its control over the entire area while pushing Palestinians away from as much land as possible. I think it would have been possibly irresponsible in the past to warn, to be too exaggerated about the risk that we are hearing now, but now it would be irresponsible to not discuss it. And this is that there is a very large portion of powerful people within the Israeli establishment who do not view this as the end goal. Their end goal is to remove Palestinians from the entire region between the river and the sea. This is something that we have to be obviously cautious about. I think it's also important to avoid exaggeration, but I think it's also crucial that we understand that when our current Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, authored his decisive plan in 2017, this plan that essentially views or provides or promises, offers Palestinians essentially just a completely subservient role with no rights whatsoever, neither individual nor collective, in the entire area under Israel's control. Right? This plan was authored in 2017 when he was this kind of extremist backbencher. He is now one of the most popular, one of the most powerful people in Israeli life. And I think there are many Israelis who are discussing his very, very bad showing in the polls and in the kind of like in public opinion polls as a kind of possible a predictor of his political faction not succeeding in our future election. I think this is very, very wrong. I think there is definitely going to be representation for the extremist, the fanatical part of the religious Zionist movement in the next parliament, possibly in the next government, and there cannot be any sort of sense that because of some political or current political problems that Smotrich is failing, his vision is not going to be continued to be promoted by the Israeli government. And I think when we're looking at what is going on the ground right now, when we're looking at the rhetoric and we're looking at what Israel has done in Gaza very easily and in the northern West Bank to refugees, I think we have to be clear that what these powerful people are hoping for is the removal of Palestinians from the area, and that, and maybe I should also mention that in B'Tselem's discussion of the genocide in Gaza, we also warned that provided that the conditions that enabled Israel's genocide in Gaza are continuing to prevail, and seeing a certain trigger, such as the trigger that B'Tselem saw as the attack, Hamas's attack on October the 7th, happen even remotely throughout the West Bank, could then lead, the risk is that this could lead to similar actions being taken against Palestinians living under Israeli control throughout the West Bank. And this is something we are warning again and again. And I think this is this is not something that we can treat lightly. So unfortunately, it seems that right now like I described earlier, there are no red lines. Settlers acting with impunity, soldiers acting with impunity, and other Israeli authorities acting with impunity are essentially are making decisions on the ground. There is no ability to resist this externally. There is simply no willingness of the international community to address this in any way. And this is, and I'll end here, this is an extremely bleak situation we are in throughout the West Bank.
Thank you. And I think it's actually been maybe not confusing, but a difficult contradiction at times to hold together this tactic of facts on the ground that often takes a very ad hoc, non-strategic appearance with a very clear longer term strategy, and with the caveat that Donald Trump campaigned as being the president to end all wars and just started the biggest one of recent memory, and that it's election season in Israel. Smotrich declared very recently that his priority for the next government will be to begin mass emigration, or to which Munir explained quite well as inextricably or necessarily forced displacement or deportation as one of the top priorities of the next government. We are basically at time. I'm going to let Omar have a minute to sign us off, but I want to thank Sarit and Munir for joining us. You weren't uplifting at all, but thank you for for your time and for explaining things that I think we need to be discussing a lot more, even as the number of problems that we in the movement and the human rights community are facing grows exponentially. That, as we discussed before, bandwidth can't be the reason that we give up on certain issues. That said, and before I give it to Omar to sign off, if you're not on Don's mailing list, please go to our website, donmina.org, and sign up. I'm sure there's an easy link to find, I hope. And feel free to donate to us as well. And we provide similar programming on lots of countries in the region that receive American diplomatic and military support, from Saudi Arabia to Israel to Egypt and the Emirates, all of whom are finding themselves in similar conundrums these days. So thank you, and Omar, it's all yours to sign off.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, listening to Sarit and Munir, it's sort of, I think the way to summarize this moment that we're at in the West Bank, and maybe more broadly in Israel Palestine. I agree, Mike, with your question that sort of taking a broader unit of analysis and a holistic look is valuable, is just to assess that two things are happening at the same time. And we have to sort of understand those things. On one hand, there is a real shift when it comes to international pressure that's real and meaningful. I mean, there are arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. The ICJ has said the occupation is illegal and there's apartheid, and has issued provisional measures and is taking very seriously allegations of genocide. Countries have cut arms sales to Israel. There have been sanctions issued against Israeli officials. The EU has put in review its trade. I could go on and on for a long time with the list. However, if I were to list you the list of abuses on the ground in Israel Palestine, the ledger would be unbalanced: genocide, escalation of ethnic cleansing, extermination, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So what we need to understand is that these things are happening at the same time. The Israeli government, some of the folks that Sarit talked about, are banking that they have this maybe once in a generation opportunity to change the map on the ground. So they are moving at breakneck pace on escalating repression. At the same time, the shifts that we see in terms of legal actions and accountability and mobilization, popular opinion, they're moving at a glacial pace. The Israeli government is banking that their pace, that by the time they conclude their changes that you heard Sarit and Munir talking about on the ground, that these shifts will have not gotten far enough to stop that. And that's really the call to action we need to take from this, is that we need to accelerate action, because we've seen what's going to happen in the absence of action. So thank you again all for joining us, for being part of Don's bigger community. And we very much look forward to seeing you in future events. Thanks again.
Thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you so much.